In this unit, we're going to discuss business challenges and implementation issues with IT security policy. So one of the challenges, as far as the business challenges, that's sort of the looking at management and how to get acceptance of these policies, how they fit into the business, and implementation issues. We're basically going to discuss, some of the, at a very high level, we'll talk about some of the issues with not only implementing policies after they're created, but also some of the issues with actually creating those policies and what's appropriate in which policies. We get into much more detail in the specific policies for the different areas of IT later on in the semester, so that starts after the midterm. But for right now, we're just going to talk very generically about some of the different areas of IT and how IT security policies are going to fit into that in the business challenge arena, and then we'll talk about implementing those actual policies. So we're going to steer clear of specific policies, but one of the things that we introduce in this unit is this idea of these domains in IT, the 7 domains of information technology in most organizations. And the reason we do this is, if you're going to create security policies, we're talking about business challenges in this unit, and one of the big challenges with creating security policy is, where do you start? How do you make sure you cover all the possible threats and all the different risks? How do you even assess the risks? Where do you even start? So one of the techniques that I like is you break, with any other problem, and this goes for anything in IT, it's always helpful to break things down into discrete components to try to look at different parts to get a picture of the whole. Anytime you're solving or trying to troubleshoot something or trying to solve a problem in information technology, or if you're developing a program or developing some kind of application, it's always a good idea to use this technique of breaking things down into these different parts. So IT security policy is no different. We can break things down into different parts, and it just so happens that there are 7 convenient ways to slice up IT. So those 7 domains are, starting on the left here, we have the user domain, which is our, the people that use information technology. So we start with the users, and again, these are the people that are actually using the technology, using computers, that are using these applications. They're not specifically technology, these are the actual users. And of course, that's a huge concern in IT security policy. Users are the wild card. They're usually what goes wrong, are the users. They're usually the ones that let the attackers in. They're the ones holding the door open. So lots of things we have to worry about with users. We have a whole chapter where we're going to discuss issues with users in IT. Then we have the workstation domain, and these are typically user-facing devices. So any device that faces the user, we would refer to as being the workstation domain. So this doesn't have to be just computers. So the workstation domain can be cellular telephones, tablets, laptops, anything that's going to face the user, anything the user is going to interact with. And then behind the workstation, usually you have some kind of a LAN. You've got some way to connect all these workstations together. So our user uses the workstation, or some kind of device. That device is interconnected to the network through the LAN. So you've got the LAN domain. So that's our protected network. That's the network that's inside our organization. And then the LAN usually interfaces to the LAN WAN domain. We'll talk more about this later, but I think most of us in IT would call this the DMZ. So, LAN WAN, I guess, is our textbook's formal way of referring to the Demilitarized Zone, to the DMZ. But you can think of the LAN WAN is really just the DMZ. And then on the right-hand side, we've got the actual WAN. So that's the wide area network. So anything that's public is the WAN. So the public, we would say, resides in the WAN domain. So somebody who's using your website, someone who's sending a request in for an order or something like that, we wouldn't really necessarily call them a user because they're not under our control. They would reside out in the WAN domain. And then on the bottom, we've got the remote access domain. So we have to have some way to give our users access to the network. So we've got the remote access domain. And then we have the server and application domain, arguably one of the most important domains in our 7 ITs. And I think this is the area that most of us work in IT, is in the server and application domain. So if we're not working on networks, most of us are working in the server and application domain, unless you're fixing workstations or something like that. So the server and application domain, these are the actual servers, the back-end equipment, the databases, our storage subsystems, everything that's hidden in a closet you can think of as being in the server and application domain. Anything that's hosted, even in the cloud, could reside in that server application domain. The cloud brings in a whole host of other issues that we we don't really touch on much yet in this part of the course, but we'll talk more about the cloud later on. Not the little cloud that you see here on the right-hand side of the WAN, just, the cloud being, some amorphous thing that we store data to for our organization. But again, we'll talk more about that later. So again, these are the 7 domains. So we can pretty much break everything that we do in IT into one of these 7 domains. So if I'm talking about a database, that's going to be in the server and application domain. If I'm talking about a switch or a router, that's going to probably be in the LAN or the LAN-WAN domain. If I'm talking about dial-up access or VPNs, that might sit out in the remote access domain, and so forth and so on. And of course, your users would be all the people that interact with this stuff. So this is the picture in your book, and I like this picture too because it kind of shows you the relationship, how the data might flow through these different domains. You got the user out there on the left. The user's working on the workstation. The workstation might connect to a switch. Please excuse the term hub. Again, this is from your textbook. I didn't make this drawing, but nobody uses hubs anymore. But you substitute the word switch for hub, and then when you've got servers that might interact with that switch, and then moving to the right, you've got your router that might be behind a firewall in the LAN-WAN domain. So usually in the LAN-WAN domain, we'll find things like routers and firewalls interfacing with the WAN, which is the public internet. And then you've got your system and application domain. I don't know that I would really draw it exactly like this. I think for me, the system application domain should be a little bit closer to the left side of the drawing. I would actually swap the remote access domain with the LAN-WAN. Although I suppose the WAN would interact with the system and application domain as well as the LAN domain. So there really should be an arrow going from the LAN-WAN domain to the system and application domain as well as the WAN domain. But either way, this is just the drawing that's in our book, so you can certainly take a look at that. Going back to my drawing, though, let's talk about some specific concerns that we might have in these different domains. So I'll do a little table here. We'll start with the user domain. And the challenge we have in the user domain is compliance. So, there's not a lot of technical controls that we can put on a user, unless you're going to, give them a little shock every time they push the wrong button, which of course we can't do. But short of that, there's really no technical controls that we can apply to the user domain. So the challenge there is compliance. How do we get people to comply with these policies that a person has to follow? And we all know that when you give people a set of rules, not everyone follows the rules. If that were the case, we wouldn't have prisons. We wouldn't need to have police departments. And obviously we do. So we know that not all people follow the rules and follow these procedures and policies. So we have to have some way to mitigate that. And our mitigation for the user domain is training, enforcement, and reward. So hopefully we reward the people who follow the policies. We train people to make sure they know what the policies are and help them to follow. I think deep down most people want to abide by some of these rules and help the organization. Everybody wants to get a paycheck, so they want the organization to be profitable, right? So that helps, of course. And enforcement. So when people do break the rules, when they do stray from the guidelines and the protocols and the procedures and all that stuff, we should have some way to pull people back and rein people back in. So that's the user domain. The next one is the workstation domain. And there are challenges to prevent breaches through the workstation domain. Obviously, people are interacting with the workstation domain. This is where people are interacting with our network the most. So that's a good attack, an attack vector for somebody trying to break into the network. So we have to prevent breaches. And of course, there's technical controls for mitigation, secure configurations, spyware, anti-spyware rather, antivirus, things like that. Which again, we talk much more in depth about later on in the semester. We'll talk about specific policies you can implement in that domain. And incidentally, in the second half of the semester, we actually break the chapters into each one of these domains. So each unit, we're going to cover one or two of these domains, and we'll talk about specific policies that you can use in each of these domains and give you some examples. I'm moving along here. We've got the LAN domain. So here we're talking about availability of the network. So that's our big challenge on the LAN domain and the other challenge too might be security. We'll talk more about some challenges with the LAN in just a little bit, but you've got the challenge that people might be able to see traffic they're not supposed to on the LAN, so that might be another challenge. But mostly network availability. People expect that if they have a local area network, that they'll be able to use it. They'll be able to get information from one place to another. They'll be able to access resources on the network. Obviously, if they can't do that, then something's wrong. That's a risk that we have to mitigate, and one of those is an AUP. So as you probably know, one of the big things that can bring down a LAN is if people are using it improperly. People are trying to listen to internet radio, or they're trying to watch, streaming video or something like that. And I'll talk more about that in a couple units. And the way to stop that is to have a good acceptable use policy, so that you know that people are hopefully using the LAN appropriately. And we'll talk more about acceptable use policies in another unit. We'll get into much more detail. And again, that also could apply to the user domain. That's obviously something that users have to be aware of. The user, the AUP. Then we have got the LAN WAN domain. So the LAN WAN domain is obviously where the DMZ would normally be. So the challenge is to secure that DMZ. And how do we do that? Well, we use technical controls, testing and monitoring. So technical controls would be things like firewalls and routers, intrusion detection systems, proxy servers, and on and on and on, things you can learn about in a network security class. And other mitigation techniques might be pen testing, so you can do penetration testing, and that could be part of your policy and procedures, that periodically somebody penetrates, does some penetration testing. That could be somebody internal, it could be somebody external to the network, so it could be an outside firm that you hire to do that penetration testing. And of course monitoring, which is something like an IDS would do, some monitoring of that DMZ. And again, the DMZ is, that outside facing portion of the network, so we have to be extra careful with the DMZ. The WAN is obviously is our connection to the public internet. So, that's our way to get to the public. And just like a brick and mortar store, one of their biggest concerns is, I got to get people into the store. You want to be on a major highway. The more traffic you have in front of your store, the more business presumably you will get. And obviously in our, in our non-brick and mortar world, in our virtual world, we also want to be on the biggest highway that we can afford. I work at a company where we're not right on the busiest highway, because we don't need to get all that traffic. So we're off the beaten path. And why are we buried away from the highway? Because that highway real estate is very expensive. Same thing in our internet world. I mean, you guys all probably know this, that the more bandwidth you have to the internet, the more expensive it's going to be. How much do you really need? So you want to make sure you're effectively utilizing that bandwidth that you have, which is a challenge, to make sure that we're using the bandwidth appropriately, which again can go back to acceptable use policies and things like that. We want to make sure it's reliable, it's fast, and of course cost effective, because we only have so much money, and the WAN is a very expensive portion of our network. It's a recurring cost, a monthly cost, and it can get pretty expensive. I think I work with some customers where their bill for their internet is in the tens of thousands of dollars a month or more. Even some of my really, really large customers that I work with, they can be almost in the hundreds of thousands when you add up all these different locations and all these MPLS circuits they have and all this crazy stuff. So we have to make sure it's cost effective. That's a challenge. So the mitigation for those challenges are technical controls, SLAs, which are service level agreements. We'll talk much more detail about what a service level agreement is and how they work. Then we have the remote access domain. So that's securing data that's outside our network. So in many cases, we have employees and customers that have to interface with our systems, and we want to make sure we keep that data secure when they're not on our network. It's a lot easier to secure data when it's sitting in our database server in our network, and we can control that LAN, and we've got complete control of that data. But what happens when somebody walks out the front door with that data on their laptop computer or on their cell phone or on a tablet or something like that? And even if they don't do it on purpose, I work in healthcare, as I said before, and doctors are really liking these tablets because they can carry them around when they go see their patients and whatnot, but they also like to bring them home at night, these tablets. And of course, what do they have on those tablets when they go home? Well, it's got patient data on it, which legally has to be protected. So, all you want, you could tell a doctor, don't give it to your kids to play with it, or don't lose it, et cetera, and tell them how important it is. But they stop at 7-Eleven to get a cup of coffee, and somebody smashes the window and steals the tablet. That data has disappeared, and now you've got a problem. So you have to have some kind of techniques to mitigate those risks. So again, that could go back to AUPs, acceptable use policies, which I talked about. We'll get into much more detail on those later. You could do encryption, things like that. And we'll talk more about some things we can do in the remote access domain later on. And finally, the system and application domain, which is, this is the big one. There's lots of stuff that we have to do in that domain. The challenges are to prevent data breaches into those systems and applications. In many cases, this is where our customer database is. This is where our intellectual property is going to be residing. This is where, pretty much all of the information about our organization or that our organization needs are going to be in this domain. So we want to make sure that we not only prevent against data breaches, but it's also available. So, one of those pillars of IT security is availability. So we want to make sure people can access that data when they need it. Some mitigation techniques that we'll talk about is DLP, data leak protection is what that stands for. We're going to talk about technical controls that we can employ to mitigate these challenges, and also encryption and high availability. So high availability is the idea that you don't just have one server that, for example, if you have a database server, if that one database server crashes, you don't have a database server and you're basically down. And if you've got lots of different applications that rely on that database server, that's a problem. So to mitigate that, you could have more than one database server, and they could be load balanced or clustered. There's lots of different techniques which you can learn about, say in a database class here at Drexel. So we can talk about in our policies about requiring high availability for certain levels of applications or for certain service level agreements with our internal customers. So those are some of the ways we can mitigate those challenges. And again, that's to protect you from failure of those systems and applications. So hopefully that gave you some idea of these different domains that we worry about in IT, or that we have to keep track of. But why organize policies by domain? I kind of explained this before. But for me, one of the big reasons is it really kind of gives you a starting point. It gives you a place to start and a way to start brainstorming about, you can start breaking things into smaller pieces, which always helps when you're trying to solve a large, seemingly insurmountable problem. In our textbook, they talk about identifying areas of policy overlap, examining areas that might otherwise be overlooked. So, again, it's a brainstorming tool, so it helps you brainstorm all the possibilities. Aligning the entire IT environment with business objectives, and this is really important, this idea of aligning your entire IT environment with business objectives. If you fail to align the IT environment with business objectives, then you're setting yourself up for failure, and not just on the IT level, but also on the IT security policy level. So, and we'll talk more about that later on. But again, that helps you think about users, think about the workstations, think about the systems and applications and all that stuff. And security policies for each domain support layered defenses. So in other security classes, you probably talked about this concept of layered security. And I think breaking out your IT infrastructure into these 7 domains also lends itself to this layered approach, because you're going to think about the user domain separately from the workstation domain, and then the workstation domain separately from the system and application domain. But you might have technical controls throughout many of these different domains that overlap with one another, that kind of have the same goal. So you implicitly end up with a layered defense by doing this, by breaking it out into these domains and thinking about them separately. It kind of helps you develop this layered approach to security, because you're protecting things sort of in the same way in these different domains, and it gives you basically those layers that they talk about. And layering isn't always having 3 firewalls. Some people, when I ask them, what is a layered approach, they say, well, that means I have 3 firewalls instead of just 1, or I use 2 antivirus programs instead of just 1 antivirus program in case one of them misses it. And you could argue that is a layered approach, but I think it kind of misses the point. Layering is using different techniques within these different domains to prevent some of the same attacks. So you're utilizing lots of different techniques, and again, these 7 domains kind of force you to do that. As I said, the user is probably one of our biggest challenges, I think, in IT security policy. It's the thing that, I think if you ask any IT security person, probably the one thing that keeps them up at night is their users. Especially when you try to support users, you start to get a real sense of what their level of sophistication is with IT security and with IT in general. It always amazes me to this day that I take phone calls from people that are in jobs that they should be somewhat technical, and I'll tell them, to do something on their computer, and they say, well, I'm really not so good with computers. Well, it's your job to use a computer all day. You would think that, being in the job for 25 years that you would be, decent with computers. But as we know, users are not very good with computers in some cases. So they don't think about IT security, or at least they don't regularly think about IT security. It's not always the forefront on their minds. So there's a lot of challenges with users. And in this chapter, in the book that I'm discussing here, they certainly go, they talk about a lot of that. So there's a lot of emphasis on the challenges with users. And so for IT security implementation, it's no different. So if we have these IT security policies and we're trying to implement those policies, the users are going to be the biggest wild card to implement those policies. Technical controls are only one part of policy. The other big part of policy is the things that people have to do. And, for most of us that have a job, we know that when somebody tells us, here's one more thing you have to do, it doesn't always go to the top of the pile. And I think IT security, it's a tough sell sometimes to get people or to convince people that it's a good idea to implement these policies. So it's definitely a challenge. So some of the motivators for people, there's three primary motivators that our book talks about. The first one is pride, which is basically perceived importance. How important are you to the organization or to your department or to the world in general. The second one is self-interest. So psychologists will tell you that people will generally do things that are in their best self-interest. That's a pretty solid psychological fact that people will always do whatever is in their best self-interest, especially if somebody yells fire in a movie theater, everybody scrambles to go out the door. And then every once in a while you hear about somebody that helps someone else. But I think by and large, humans are very much motivated through self-interest. The other piece is success. So, everybody wants to be part of a winning team. So success is another motivator. So if you take these three motivators, if you take the pride or the perceived importance, the self-interest, which is things like rewards and discipline. In other words, people will do things, and there's different personality types, which I'll talk about in the next slide. But sometimes you can use rewards to entice people to do the right thing, and sometimes you can use discipline to entice people not to do the wrong thing. And different people react differently to these, but that's certainly one motivator. The other one is being on a winning team. Nobody wants to be on the losing team. Most people want to be on the winning team. So that's a powerful motivator. You take these three motivators, and in the middle there, I probably should have put in the middle there, you put these three together, and that's where you get your motivation to implement these policies. So if you can spin or somehow present these policies to play to pride, self-interest, and success, then you have a much easier time getting people to adopt these policies. Whenever I get to this portion in this course, I feel like I'm teaching a class on sales. It's it's very similar to sales. So if any of you have any experience doing sales or have done sales, a lot of that skill set I think you can apply to some of this stuff. So moving along here, people have to understand the key concepts of security policy. So not only do we want to motivate people to adopt these policies and implement these policies, but we also need them to understand the policies. And the reason we want them to understand those is because when somebody fully understands those policies, it makes it a little bit easier for them to apply those policies in ambiguous situations. So if anything unanticipated happens, if they fully understand the policies and why you have those policies and what the goals of those policies are, then I think people make more informed decisions when either they don't know the policy in the moment, or if there is no policy that applies to their current situation, then they say, yeah, you know what, I probably shouldn't do that, or maybe this is what I should do based on what I know about the policies. So certainly understanding is, and of course that all goes back to training, which we'll talk about. So as far as how to deal with people, when you're trying to implement these policies, again, it's a lot like being a salesman. And IT security policy cannot be successful if people are not adopting those policies or implementing those policies. And the thing about getting these policies adopted is, you have to get everyone on board with adopting them. And again, it's kind of a sales pitch. And if you take a sales class, they'll talk to you about different personality types, and that when you're attempting to persuade someone, if you know what personality type they are, you can craft your pitch to that person based on their personality type to make it more likely that they're going to adopt whatever it is you're trying to persuade them to do, which in this case is an IT security policy. And like I said, in many cases in IT security policy, we're kind of selling these policies. We can do all this work to create the best policies in the world, but if no one is adopting them and enforcing them, then it's all for naught. So these are the different personality types our book talks about. There are many others, but these are the ones that our book discusses. And the first one is commander. This is a demanding and forceful attitude. The drifter is you're laid back. They lack discipline, so they're not as disciplined as these other types. The attacker is an angry, critical, egotistical person. So, if you're dealing with the attacker personality type, I always call the attacker, this is the heckler. Whenever I teach a class, an in-person class, if I've got 30 students, and I can always count on one of them being the heckler. This is the one that is very disagreeable about everything. Well, that's not how I've seen it done, or that's not how I know this is done, or something like that. And you always have to, but sometimes, that you can use that egotistical personality type to your advantage. So you can build that ego a little bit to kind of persuade them. So there's techniques to do that. The pleaser is the kind and thoughtful person that's self-sacrificing. They're always willing to help. So you could say, hey, it'd be a really great help if you would help me implement these policies, something like that. The performer is the witty, charming, the focal point of the room. It's that person that everyone pays attention to when they walk in the room. So certainly can play up that personality type. The avoider is, I have on here avoids extra work. I think an avoider is not always a bad thing. They may avoid that extra work, but what work they do have, they're usually dependable and consistent with that work. So, they're usually more, they'll focus on the work that they have to do, but come 5 o'clock, okay, I'm done, and they go home. And there's certainly something to be said for that, that concentrating on your work when it's time to do the work, but then, not taking on extra stuff that you can't handle. Whereas, somebody like the pleaser might be willing to take on all this extra work, but they might spread themselves so thin that they can't really do all that work, as well as maybe the avoider could by turning away that extra work. And then you've got the analytical, which is disciplined, precise, detail-oriented, and the achiever, which is result-oriented. So with an achiever, you might set goals. You might say, okay, my goal is to not have any data security breaches for 30 days. If your department can do that, then then you get the pride of saying that you guys implemented these policies and didn't have any infiltration to the network or something like that. So there are a lot of folks will have more than one of these personality types, and we'd all be pretty flat characters in a book if we were exactly one of each of these types. So more often than not, people will be a combination of a few of these. But typically, one of them, they'll blend, but one of them will emerge as the dominant personality type. So if you can identify what personality type you're dealing with, it certainly helps you sway that person to your or persuade that person to your argument, which in this case is implementing IT security policies. So you can lever the strengths and the weaknesses of these different personality types during the implementation to get these folks to implement these policies. Another piece of this whole implementation is understanding the organization and the structure of the organization, because that can give you some insight into how important IT security is going to be to the organization. So, one thing, any company you work for, you can review the organizational structure to get a lot of insight. So the organizational structure, the first thing is it affects employee behavior. So to give you an example of that, I think in the lab I asked you to do some research in flat versus hierarchical organizational structures. And in a hierarchical organizational structure, you've got it looks like a Christmas tree. Starts at the top and it kind of filters down, and the rank and file is pretty far removed from the top of the Christmas tree, the CEO or the president of the company. There's a lot of layers of management and layers of people from the bottom to the top. So those employees will behave much differently than, say, in a flat organization. So in a flat organization, you might have the CEO or the president at the top, and then right below them will be both managers and then rank and file employees. So for example, where I work, we're a very small company, and anytime I can pick up the phone or I can walk into the office of the president of the company. But I have friends that work at much larger companies who couldn't even tell me who the president of the company is. It's so large, I don't even know who that is, or couldn't tell you who the CFO is or the CIO or something like that. So you'll do some exercises in the lab concerning that, and that'll certainly provide some insight into how the employees will behave, and then seeing who everyone answers to in the organizational structure will give you some insight into the priorities of the company. So you might see in a financial company, obviously the CFO in a financial company like a bank is much more prominent than in, say, an engineering company. So I work in a small engineering company. The CFO is, I don't even know if we have one right now. It's not a major role in the company. As long as somebody's collecting the money and paying the bills, things move on. But in a bank, it's a completely different priority. So the CFO might be much more important in something like a bank. And on the flip side, in a technology company where I work, the CTO and the CIO are extremely important. The CTO in the company I work for is responsible for product development, and it's very central to what we do. Whereas, say, in the bank, the CTO might not be as important. It's not the focus of the business. The technology is there to support the business, not because that is their business. So that could certainly give you some insight into the priorities. So influence and authority of the information security officer can be implied based on their position in the organizational chart, which I'm going to show you some examples of that in just a moment. So if the CSIO or the CISO, which is the Chief Information Security Officer, so this would be the person who's responsible for implementing IT security policies. This is the person that's responsible for enforcing IT security, for brainstorming all this stuff. This is the guy that's in charge, or the girl that's in charge of IT security. If they work in the IT department and answer to, say, an IT director, who then answers to a CTO, and then a CIO, and then the CFO, and then the CEO, then you're pretty low on that totem pole. You're kind of near the bottom. You're a lot closer to the rank and file. So your authority isn't as persuasive as if you were reporting directly to the CFO or the CIO or even the CEO. And I've even seen some organizations where the Chief Information Security Officer does answer directly to the CEO, and they're lateral with the CIO or the CTO. So here's an example of an organizational chart. So you've got, in this case, this could just be a generic company. You've got the president at the top, and then you've got these different business lines, and then, regardless of the business line, so for example, you've got production for business line number 2 and production for business line number 1, but they both are, lateral to the information technology department and the HR department. So, as you can see in this organizational chart, there's one information technology department for the entire organization. There's no IT department in each one of those lines of businesses. Where other organizational charts, you might see IT within different lines of the business, or you might see finance in different lines of the business. So again, this gives you kind of a sense of the layout of the company. In this example, take a look at where our Chief Information Security Officer is. You've got the Office of the President, and then under the President, you've got the CFO, and then under the CFO, you've got the CISO. But then contrast that with this organizational chart where we've got the President, but then you got a Chief Information Officer, then there's a CTO that answers to the CIO, and then below that is the CISO. And they're lateral to the DBA and the Program Manager, which, for most of us, I think we would classify that as rank and file IT. So that person's going to have a lot less authority than this person in this company, in this other slide. So again, it gives you, and that you can imply from this the priorities for information security. So you kind of know where you stand, I guess, when you look at this. Regardless of that hierarchy, that organizational structure, you've got to have executive management support. And if your data aligns with business objectives, and your business objectives align with compliance regulations, and your security policy implementation aligns with all that stuff, then you can be pretty sure you're going to get executive management support. So, executive management is going to look at kind of downstream from the policies, do the policies support the mission of the business? Does the data and IT department support the mission of the business? And if that happens, does the IT security policy support the mission of those applications and data? And if that's true, does that support regulations? And if that's true, then management's going to say, you know what, these IT security policies are a great idea. But if that's not true, so if the opposite's true, then management's going to say, you know what, IT security is not a big priority for us. We don't really need that because it's not really supporting the mission of the business. So it's important to understand that. So let's talk about the policy, the implementation process. So, how we actually go about implementing these policies. By the way, so far in this course, we haven't really talked about specifically how to write these policies. We're going to get to that. I know it feels like we're putting the cart before the horse here. We're talking about implementing policies that we don't even have yet. But this is just, an early part of the course. We talk about implementation and how we go about basically the process for creating and implementing these policies and how we identify the business risks and the business challenges. And then we talk about specific policies, of course, in the second part of the semester. But this first part, we're going to talk about what we're talking about here, but then we're also going to talk about the frameworks of these policies, how you organize the policies, and then we'll get into more of the minutia of how to write them and create them and where you put them and all that stuff. But if you're going to implement if you're going to create and implement these policies, the first step is you're going to identify business risks. Well, that's a pretty tall order. How do we do that? So, risks vary by industry and organization. But to do that, we're going to use the 7 domains. So if I asked you to identify some risks in a business, where you could start is go back to that slide where I showed the 7 domains in IT. Start on the left side with the user domain and follow data all the way through the process. And it's easy to start at the user side because you can go talk to a user and say, okay, tell me what kind of information you use. Show me how you conduct a transaction. Show me how you ship a package. Show me how you put it in an order. Show me how you send money to a customer or something like that, how you pay a bill. So you can get a real sense of the data that people use at the user domain, and that gives you a starting point. So you can say, okay, in my user domain, this is the information they use. How does that information flow through the other 7 domains all the way to the WAN side? So what are the steps? What are the things that it's touching? What applications does that data touch? What systems does it touch? What kind of network equipment is it going through? What kind of bandwidth does it require? What kind of availability do we require, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So it really starts to open the door on identifying these risks when you break it down into these 7 domains and you follow the data through all those domains. So again, that's going to let you map all your challenges and risks to those 7 domains. And then we're going to take those, and you'll notice that some of those challenges are common among many of the domains, so you can kind of streamline that a little bit. Then we can develop, so once we know what the risks are, so once you've got your risks, then we develop policies that mitigate those risks. So again, we're going to identify the information, we're going to follow it through those 7 domains to identify all the risks, and then we're going to create policies that mitigate those risks. So each of the 7 domains can have different types of risks associated with them. The policies can reduce or mitigate those risks. So a policy must address as many risks in that domain as possible. So in our user domain policies, we're going to try to mitigate all of the risks in that domain. And the policies could cross the different domains. So you don't have to pigeonhole yourself into one domain at a time as you write policies. They're going to kind of blend together these different domains. And again, the idea of these domains is not a structural thing for our policies. It's more of a thought exercise to figure out where our risks are and to figure out what policies we're going to need to mitigate those risks. But those policies by no means have to reside specifically within each of these domains. Again, it's more of a thought exercise. So users may not perceive when they look at these policies, oh yeah, this policy applies to the user domain and this policy applies to the workstation domain. You and I might notice that or perceive that, but again, it's just a thought exercise. So the steps to implement policy, there are, in our textbook, they talk about these 8 steps, and it kind of reminds me of that book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. It's Is a guy that I work with who's a salesman, and he always talks about this idea of, he always says, well, we're going to set the table. And what he means by that is that we are going to structure our language and the way we go about talking to a customer or what have you in such a way that it's going to set the table so things go our way. And for implementation for IT security policy, it's kind of what we're doing. And like I said, implementation of security policy is not always a major priority, and it's something we have to work hard to make sure people are going to adopt and implement. So it is a lot like sales, more or less. So in our 8 steps, number 1, we create urgency. So we try to create this, this perception of urgency, and there's some truth to that, right? I mean, at any time somebody could steal the data, somebody could, do whatever. If I told you that I don't have homeowners insurance on my house, it's not very likely that my house is going to burn down, but you do have that sense of urgency that you feel unprotected. So you can play that up that, hey, we're not protected. There's a sense of urgency for us to protect ourselves here. Maybe we're not going to get hacked tomorrow. Maybe we're not going to get attacked the next day, but it's going to happen at some point. So we need to be prepared for that. So once you've got that sense of urgency, then you can form a coalition of people that, like-minded people. Form a coalition. Usually you want to try to get people that are in at least one person that's in a powerful position, in a C-level position, and you're going to create this vision for change. I feel like I'm teaching a self-help course here, but you create a vision for change. The 4th step is, now I change color here because the first part is, not specific. It's more just, as I said, it's that setting the table. It's setting yourself up for success with this implementation. Then we actually start doing things. At that point, we communicate the vision of what we're trying to do. We remove obstacles. We create short-term wins. So we try to give yourself little wins to say, okay, we just implemented this policy and we haven't had any viruses in 5 days or 10 days or whatever it is. When people see that it's working, they're more likely to continue adopting these policies. And then you can keep building on that change, and you can anchor changes in culture. So eventually, by step 8, hopefully you've changed the culture by now. So you've created this sort of security culture, and finally have fully implemented your policies. Once you've implemented all those policies, the trick is to keep people on board with those policies. So you have to overcome apathy. At some point, and it's kind of like going to the gym after New Year's, right? Everybody makes this New Year's resolution. Everyone runs to the gym and starts to work out, but then you get into this, this apathy where, people start to drop off. So you got to keep people excited about it to keep them, interested in continuing to utilize these policies, follow the policies, etc. So some tips for overcoming apathy: engage leadership and adjust implementation strategy to include role-based explanation of the policies. We can reinforce the importance and value of information security through ongoing awareness program. So periodically you can have awareness training. You can require awareness training. In some of the schools that I teach, they require us to do periodic, harassment training and chemical safety training and so forth. I don't even work with, chemicals very often, but yet every year I have to take this training class that tells me how to deal with dangerous substances. I have to know how to deal with blood and how to deal with, spilling of chemicals and things like that. I had to take a sexual harassment awareness training every year because, it's very unlikely that I'm going to sexually harass someone, but they want it to be, something we're constantly reminded of to mitigate that risk. So IT security policy is no different. Every year you could say everyone has to do, a 15-minute or a 20-minute IT security training seminar, or it could be online training or something. And we'll talk more about ways to do that later in the semester. In the user domain, we'll discuss a lot of those things. With leadership should set the expectation that policy will be followed, and they'll monitor compliance. So people should know that they're being, that this is being watched, that executive management expects people to be to abide by these policies. So that can help overcome apathy. Increase involvement by introducing redundancy. So our book talks a lot about redundancy in people. The idea that you don't want a single person ever, you don't want to rely on a single person for any specific task and things like that. And IT security policy is no different. We don't want to rely on a single individual whenever possible. So here's some examples. So we're switching gears here a little bit. We've talked about the implementation of these security policies, and I'm going to kind of fast forward here a little bit. Again, we're going to talk in much more detail about each one of these domains of IT security later on, but some examples of controls. So I talked in the last lecture about technical controls or automated controls that are technical, that are technical types of controls. We talked about that stuff, these different types of controls. And I'll kind of briefly touch on these for the 7 domains just to give you an idea of how these would apply. So in the user domain, authentication would be one type of technical control. In the workstation domain, we can use central management systems. In the WAN domain, we can use virtual private networks. In the LAN domain, we can talk about different types of networks. In the LAN to WAN domain, we can use a DMZ as a technical control. In the system and application domain, we can use data loss prevention. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. And in the user, workstation, LAN, remote access, and all these different domains, we can use authentication and access control, which I kind of already touched on. So let me give you kind of a more detailed view of each one of these. So authentication from a very high level, and again, we'll talk more about this later on, but I think most of you are probably familiar with this at this point in your academic career. You've already probably talked about authentication in just about every IT security class you've taken. So by the time you get to a 400 level, you've probably been through this about 9 times, but doesn't help to go through it again, I suppose. But so you got validation of credentials as authentication. So it's basically identifying who you are. And how do we do that? There's 3 ways. Something you know, which could be a user ID or a password, or a user ID and password. Something that you have, which could be a token, a smart card. There's a company I've been seeing everywhere now called Improvito, which is you basically swipe your employee ID to log into a workstation, so that might be a token-based. And then something that you are, which would be biometrics, your fingerprint, retina scan, palm print, things like that. And you probably had other classes that talk about all these in much more detail. But this is how you can validate credentials. So when we talk about single factor, it's one of these credentials. When we talk about multi-factor, it's more than one of these. So examples for multi-factor are, 2-factor and 3-factor. So 2-factor would be user ID and password and a token. By the way, user ID and password are not 2 different factors. That's one that's both something that you know. So that only counts for 1 factor. Multi-factor is if we tack something else onto that, like a token. You could also combine for 2-factor something like a token and some biometrics. So it could be your ID card gets swiped and you do a retina scan, and that would be 2-factor authentication. You could also do 3-factor. You could make somebody put in a password, swipe an ID card, and do a retina scan or a thumbprint or something like that. So that would be 3-factor. In our book, they talk about that whatever method you choose should support or suit the business context. So in other words, does it make sense to force somebody to do 3-factor authentication to log into their email account? Most cases probably not, depending on how secure that email needs to be. However, someone who's accessing some kind of financial system, maybe 2-factor does make sense. So there's different business context. So you don't always have to pick one of these authentication methods. It could be a combination of them depending on the severity of the level of protection that you need for that data. All right. So we talked about that, different business context. So authorization and access control, which that was kind of a broad thing that can cover lots of different domains. But access control is determining who has access to what. So authentication is who you are. So the last slide we just looked at was identifying who someone is, where authorization is we already know who they are at this point. We're determining what are they allowed to access. So who is the user, device, or service. So the who are you, the authentication is not always a person. It can also be a device or a service. So a service is a program that runs in the background on a computer is a service. Both Linux and Windows have special programs that can run as a service, which I'm sure you already know about from other classes or your real world experience. So don't always think of the who as a person. Try to think outside the box as a device or a service as well. And in our book, they talk about role-based access control. This is probably one of the most common ways of managing access to resources on a network. It's going to be the most efficient. It's the most common. If you're familiar with something like Active Directory or LDAP, a lot of that is role-based access control. So you assign permissions to roles, which are essentially groups of people that you can assign individuals to. So it reduces administrative overhead and improves compliance through reduced complexity. I'll kind of describe, why is this so much better? If you have different users, so here I've got managers, I've got users, and then I've got all these different devices that they have access to. I essentially, for each one of these people, I have to manage all of the different things that they're allowed to access to. So that can get pretty complicated. You can see these lines are, crisscrossing all over the place. It's sort of a mesh of lines, and each one of those lines represents some object that I have to manage or define in an IT security policy, and later on in an actual Active Directory policy or in a Linux access control. So substitute that with role-based access. You can see here with role-based, it's a lot simpler. Those big blue circles are roles. So you have a manager role and a staff role. And from those roles, so users all point to a role, and then that role defines what they're allowed to access. So if I want to change what users are allowed to access, I only have to go into the role to do that. And by the way, in the Active Directory world, we might talk more about groups and things like that, but just from a very generic standpoint, you've got users, and the users can have a role, and that role defines what they're allowed to access. So you can manage the role as opposed to individual users. I also talked about central management systems. The idea behind a central management system is to enforce security policy through the central management of your technical controls and your technical assets. So not just management, but also configuration. So as an example, inventory management software that tells you about all the computers that you have, what's on those computers, where they're located. That would be an automated or a centralized management system. You can have discovery software that discovers software and data on your network, so it looks for what type of software is installed on all the workstations. Is there anything that shouldn't be there? Patch management, which makes sure that you have all the latest patches on your servers and your workstations, which, as we know, is important for IT security and availability. Help desk, which helps you track all this stuff. Log management to help you track logging and review logs and do auditing and things like that. And security management. So there's obviously some automated security management tools, which we're going to talk about in the last unit. We'll talk about security management or centralized management systems for IT security. There are, in the other part, when we talked about the LAN domain, so an example of a technical control in the LAN domain might be different types of networks. So I think a lot of us are familiar with flat networks. A flat network is where all the devices are interconnected in the network. So it's one big network, and everyone can talk to everything. And our book says all network traffic is visible. I would disagree with that to some extent, because no one uses a hub anymore, and it's pretty complicated to sniff traffic on a network through a switch if you don't have physical access to it to find a promiscuous port or something like that. But the thing is, I think more importantly though, with a flat network, you have access to everything on the network. So if you know the IP address or the host name of a device on the network, chances are you're able to access it. So a segmented network can help mitigate that, or kind of give you a better topology for the network by segmenting different parts of the network. So, for example, if you have a research and development department, they could be on their own segmented LAN that's separate from, say, the finance department. So if somebody works in finance, they would have no access to computers that reside in the research and development division. And again, this is kind of goes back to that layered approach, because you might have a policy that says you can't use file sharing on an individual workstation, but for some reason somebody turns on file sharing on one of the computers in R&D. If everyone's all on the same huge network, then everyone in the organization now has access to files on that R&D computer. But if it's a segmented network, then the only people that will be able to see those files are people that are on the same network. So it's obviously going to be other R&D employees, and then it's not so much of a concern. So you're not as concerned about that. But if if folks from the finance department or the HR department or whatnot have access to those files, that might be more of a concern. So a segmented network can help us, is a technical control that can help us secure the LAN. So, and that's just one example. We're going to talk about a lot more of these later on in the semester. I talked about for the LAN WAN, the Demilitarized Zone, the DMZ, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with this concept. If you've got the internet and you never want to connect the internet or the WAN to your private network, you would typically put a firewall in between. But if you have a DMZ, you've got two firewalls, and in between the two firewalls, you'll have your demilitarized zone. It may not be two physical firewalls. Logically, you've got two firewalls, though. So you'll have one set of IP addresses on one side of the firewall. You'll have another set that's sort of in the middle, and then you've got your internet out on the left-hand side in this drawing. So the DMZ is widely considered to be best practice in IT. Any organization that has a server or some kind of application that requires access from the internet will generally be in a DMZ. And the idea is that in the DMZ, users that are in the private network can access things in the DMZ, and users on the internet can access things in the DMZ. However, the internet, as an example, can't get to the private network, and the private network doesn't have unfettered access to the internet. So there's this sort of layer of control, this technical control in the middle. And likewise, there may be, say, a list of customers on the private network, and there might be a service in the DMZ that can access that list to provide it to users on the internet. But there's that extra layer of security that if somebody infiltrates the DMZ, they don't have the full list of customers. They only have the ones that that they were given access to in the DMZ, or that were maybe cached in the DMZ. You can think of it that way. So it sits between the secure LAN and the unsecure WAN, and it acts as a buffer. It's funny that the term DMZ has really become the de facto term for this, but I always thought of it as the lobby, the network lobby. That's how I always explained it to people, that you wouldn't have when you've got customers coming into your office building, they don't walk right into the back office. They come into a lobby, and that's where they interface with, that's where the public interfaces with the company. You may bring someone back into the private area, but it's much more controlled. Whereas just anyone can walk into the lobby in just about any building. So it can contain both servers that provide public access, like web servers, portals, anything that the public has to interact with. And there could also be some authentication involved with that too, which we'll talk about later. In the WAN zone, we talk about, or the remote access zone, we talk about virtual private networking. Again, this is one of those concepts I think most students are familiar with when they get to a course like this. But when we talk about WANs, there's two types. You have public internet. So the public internet is the internet that we connect to get to all the public websites, to get anywhere on the internet. But then we can also have a private internet, our own private wide area network, where we lease lines and no other traffic is on those connections. Sometimes it's packet switch network, sometimes it's leased lines, sometimes it's there's lots of different options for that, MPLS circuits and things like that. But if you have a network like that, if you have a circuit like that, the idea is that no one else is in that circuit. So it's already implicitly protected. There's nothing you have to do to protect that data. You own the infrastructure between point A and point B. It's just as if you stretched an Ethernet cable from one room to another. Obviously, it's much more complicated than that in practice, but conceptually, that's what a private WAN is. Obviously, that's too expensive for most people, and you wouldn't do a private WAN between two different companies or different organizations, but you still have to have some way to protect the information. So a virtual private network creates this virtual network between two nodes that no one can see into. By encrypting, you create, kind of this, conceptually, you create a tunnel where the traffic between 2 points is encrypted, so no one can see into that tunnel, that encrypted tunnel. So you're leveraging the public internet as your private internet by encrypting the traffic between 2 points. So obviously the benefits are it's a lot cheaper than a private WAN, and you can very rapidly deploy that. If you wanted to create a VPN with another company, it just takes an hour to set that up, and you're good to go. In most cases, if everything goes swimmingly, then it'll be rapid deployment. Of course, in reality, it doesn't always go so easy, but But it's certainly a lot easier than creating some kind of circuit between two organizations. In that case, you've got contracts that have to get signed. You've got infrastructure that has to be put in. All kinds of things have to happen, and it's a big project. And finally, this is our last slide. So we're almost done. The last thing that I talked about in the 7 domains, I talked about data loss protection on the WAN domain. So, and what is data loss protection? That's or data leakage protection, DLP. It's this idea that you're actively trying to prevent confidential information from leaving the organization, either accidentally or maliciously. So somehow that data could leave the company. And like everything else, it requires layers of defense, inventory, all of the data that's intended to be kept secret. So you can identify all of that data where it rests. So you don't know what you have until you know what you have. So it's a good idea to inventory all that data, of course. And you can do some monitoring of the perimeter. And finally, you can do encryption of that data. So I'll talk more about these. For data loss protection, we're going to talk more about data loss protection later on. But just as kind of as a starter here, in a policy, I'll talk about ways that you can do this, that I've seen companies do this. One way is, I work in healthcare, and one thing you don't want is doctors emailing or nurses emailing patient records outside the organization. You don't want that data to leave the organization. So I've seen hospitals now put in these intelligent email systems that have access to the electronic medical record systems. So as emails are leaving the organization, it searches the emails for anything that it thinks could be patient information or private patient data. And it does that. So if it sees a patient's ID number or a social security number or the name of a patient appears in a document, it stops the email and it encrypts it and still sends an email to the end user, but it says, hey, you have an email, but we have to encrypt it, so you have to go sign into this portal to access that email. So that's one way that you can prevent that data from, so that would be perimeter monitoring in this case. So you could have some policy that talks about how to, that you should implement or you are required to implement something that does that. Another example is encryption, which I just described. Not only was that email software monitoring the perimeter, but when it did allow that data to leave the perimeter, it made sure that it was encrypted. And really, in that case, what the organization is trying to do, they're not saying that the data can't leave the organization. There are certainly legitimate reasons that a doctor would get a patient's medical record from one organization to another. So you still want that data to be able to leave, but you want to make sure it's encrypted all the way to the endpoint where to whoever the user is on the other side. Now, of course, once they get that data, it's up to them to encrypt downstream. You really have no control over that. But we've done our due diligence if we've encrypted the data down to their endpoint. So that's it. Tried to keep this under an hour. So we're just about a little over an hour. I apologize. And that concludes the second lecture for the course. When you go into Blackboard, you should see some assignments and some labs to give you some practice with this stuff. And as always, if you have any questions, please reach out. Thank you.